Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone, from wherever you're joining us, and welcome to today's webinar titled Joint Clinical Assessments 2025, Pioneering Pathways for Oncology, Advanced Therapies, and Rare Diseases. Today, 4 experts will discuss strategies for managing EU joint clinical assessment requirements and their impact on local health assessments. I'd like to thank the sponsor of today's event, ICON, for making it all possible. I now want to take a moment to introduce our speakers for today's session. First up, we have Mia Malmenas, Senior Principal at ICON, and she brings 25 years experience from the pharmaceutical and CRO sector. She also has extensive experience in evidence generation, methodology, and planning. Then we have Andrew Minix, a divisional principal at ICON, serving as the head of the HTA and value communications team. Andrew brings over 25 years experience working in market access, pricing, and reimbursement of pharmaceutical treatments across the product lifecycle for the UK, EU, and international markets. Next, we have Xin Zhao, Global Market Access Principal at ICON, bringing extensive experience in both early and late-stage asset development strategies. Her experience encompasses market access and pricing roles across the US, Europe, Japan, and China. And last but not least, we have Liz O'Brien, who is a physician scientist and former regulator at EMA Efficacy Working Party and National Competent Authority Ireland. She's a veteran of the life science industry with a long career spanning executive medical affairs and clinical development, commercialization, and deep expertise in oncology and women's health. She's a member of ICON's drug development and consulting group for oncology and women's health. And now, without any further delay, I'm going to bring Mia on to introduce the outline for today. Mia, take it away whenever you're ready.
Thank you. So I'm very happy to be here today and see that so many people have joined the webinar. This is the outline of our presentation today. It's going to be an introduction to the joint clinical assessment, a short overview, including PICO and evidence generation process and the PICO simulation. Moving forward to effective dossier development and the country level response to GCA, and also going into the impact on clinical trial development that GCA has. And we were going to end the presentation with a question and answer session. So moving forward to talk about the GCA process and the timelines. So the GCA process was mandated this year. It includes around 27 countries, plus Norway, Switzerland, Ukraine, and UK. It was set up to streamline the procedure for applicants to improve coordination and faster access to medical products. So setting up this process would make medicines faster to market. The NITA played a large part of this process. It created all the guidelines and the templates that are available for this process. And it started this year in January for oncology projects and advanced therapies, moving on to include rare diseases in 2028. And for 2030, the rest of the medicine products are going to be included. It only includes efficacy and safety. So health economic and pricing evaluations are done in a separate stage with the local HTA agencies. The process includes a lot of stakeholders, 7 to be precise. It's the EU HTA coordination group that oversees the process. They also then approve the joint scientific consultation report, which is one of the subgroups of 2. There is another subgroup which leads the joint scientific assessment as well. So the 2 subgroups in the process. We also have the health technology development, which are you as the ones that are submitting to the GCA and to the EMA. It also includes individual experts such as patient clinical expertise, where they have an impact on the evidence generation that is generated for this process. The HTA Secretariat in the European Commission are handling the administration and take care of the IT and the administration, and it's also linked to the European Medicine Agency as well. We wanted to highlight some key stages of this process that you need to take into consideration and put into your planning. The first one is the joint scientific consultation, which is one of the subgroups that I just talked about. That enables you to get a first information about what kind of PICOs and what kind of evidence generation that you should collect. So the start of the process, you should apply to get the scientific advice, and you should try to put that into your calendar as soon as possible, at the latest at end of phase 2, so that you can include the information that you get from the consultation into the development of the phase 3 trial. You also need to set up some planning for mock PICO analysis. It's very important for the process that you have evaluated what kind of evidence is needed for the process. So please do make time to do that as early in the process as possible. The joint scientific consultation and the mock PICO analysis then goes into the evidence generation plan that also needs to be started quite early in the process. And from the result of what you have in the evidence generation plan, you then need to go out and get additional data and additional evidence using different methodologies such as ITC, SLRs, real-world data, etc. All the evidence that you collect then goes into the GCA dossier, and as such, the GCA dossier is set to be around 700 pages. It's quite an undertaking to produce a GCA dossier. I also wanted to give you an overview of the current process. As this just started this year, it could actually be changing slightly when we have the results from the first products going through the process. As I said in my previous slide, the joint scientific consultation is a very important step, and it should be happening prior to you have finalized your clinical trial program. You need to set it up as early as possible because there are limited slots, and it would really help your development of the evidence to have that in place and get the advice from the consultation, so that you have a start on understanding on what kind of evidence it is that you need to provide. The process in itself starts when you submit to MIA for a market authorization. At the same time as you submit to MIA, you then submit to the GCA process as well. When you submit all the information that you have, and then when that has received the GCA, they will give you an assessor, appoint you an assessor that would help with the process. The assessor is in charge of creating the PICO survey, and that it starts by putting together the PICOs that they think are necessary for your indication and for your comparators, and then they send the survey to the different membership states to ask for their input on the PICOs that they have put together. The member states then send in the information back to the coordinator, and the coordinator sends you a report on what it is that you need to assess for your product. When you get this report back, you have 100 days until you need to submit the GCA dossier, so it's very short timelines. And for that purpose, it is very important that you have actually started this work early, so that you are prepared and not need to create all the evidence in that short time frame. When you submit the dossier, there will be a time in between that you get the report back from the DCA process, and during that time, the DCA assessor can send you questions that you need to go back and answer to. When the DCA report is released, you will then have 7 days to come back with comments on the report, and before it's closed. And then the report itself will be used for the local HTA submissions to be evaluated for safety and efficacy. That said, you need to go to the local HTA agencies that you want to go for pricing and reimbursement. And as I said, they are supposed to take the report into consideration, but that doesn't mean that they don't actually ask you to provide additional evidence on safety and efficacy. Looking at this process, it's quite clear. It includes quite many more steps than previous process, and it adds complexity, requiring additional work and coordination by you as manufacturers to meet the data requirements and timelines. The PICO framework is the backbone for the evidence generation. It outlines all of the information that you need for the evidence that is needed to be created. The PICO framework is defined as population, and the population that you need to take into consider is the full population, and then the subpopulations that need to be applied for your drug. You need to take in the I stands for intervention, and the intervention that you use should reflect the evaluation that for the indication which you have applied for the regulatory submission dossier. The comparators need to reflect the real world and should include all the comparators and the standard of care that are used by the membership states. And the outcomes needs to reflect and be estimations of relative effectiveness, of safety and efficacy, and symptoms. So as I said, PICOs, they are the ones that specify data requirement and is a framework for the assessment and is outlaying all the evidence needs that you need to have for the submission. So as I said, we are envision that there is going to be a greater need to provide more information and more evidence than for the previous process. And the PICO set up is set up so that you, depending on different scenarios, you're going to get different number of PICOs. So this slide outlines the considerations for comparators of a given patient population, outlining different scenarios for comparators within the patient populations and the impact that they have on the PICOs. So in the first scenarios, we have one unique comparator, only one comparator that needs to be compared to your treatment. So the effectiveness against a unique comparator is required, and that means that it's going to be one PICO, one analyze against your treatment for each outcome. In the second scenario, we have several comparators, meaning more than one. That means that there are two different scenarios for this, for estimating the number of PICOs. Either you can treat them separately, meaning that you need to do your comparison against each for the different outcomes, or you can combine them as a combined treatment, depending on the environment and how they're used in real life. And then it will be a comparison on the outcomes against your treatment for one PICO. The last scenario is a comparison when you have individualized treatment, meaning different treatment options. where you need to take care of, where you can't divide it into subgroups. You actually, but you need to take into consideration the individual treatment pathway. So in that case, you need to compare against that treatment sequence, and that means 1 pico for the whole treatment sequence. So as you see from this outline, it means that there will be a substantial increase in the evidence needs. And it is important to make sure that you have taken that into consideration in your evidence generation plan. You also, in this process, need to consider different perspectives. So when you go out and investigate your PICOs, you need to also include information from a statistical point, a clinical point, a patient point of view, and clinicians, amongst others. There are also one new thing in this setup, and that is that you actually now need to have a HTA-HER SAP that is pre-specified before database lock when you're leveraging the insights from the PICOs from your trial. So that's a new thing that hasn't been required before, even though I know a lot of companies already use this and set this up. So we've been working a lot with trying to identify PICOs in the past and trying to put up a process that that can guide you on how you're going to get the PICOs needed and the evidence generation process in place. So the first thing to do is that you need to evaluate the national and payer PICO requirements. You need to understand the payer and decision drivers. You need to make sure that you have the landscape assessment on the European market decisions for the relevant drug class and indication. So that's the first step that we recommend. After that step, we suggest that you go and identify the PICOs needed. And if you're lucky, you already have had the discussion with the consultant discussions, and you have some good idea on this. If not, if this is happening before, then we suggest to do a PICO simulation. What we use today is an AI tool to make this faster and quicker. And then when we have the PICO simulations, we validate them with market access stakeholders across Europe to make sure that they are aligned with their requests. After the PICO identification has been completed, the information from step 1 and step 2 needs to be fed into the evidence generation plan. It needs to include a clear pathway for execution. And I also want to say that when you create the evidence generation plan, don't only think about the GCA evidence generation plan. Think about an evidence generation plan that includes the evidence needed for GCA, for regulatory, and for the local HTA. Make sure that you try to ensure that you can use the studies that you have included and the ways to gather evidence in multiple ways for multiple purposes. So by including all these three insights, it will be easier for you to make sure that you have the evidence that you need. After the evidence generation plan has been started and set in place, please do evaluate the risk and opportunities that you have in there. Make sure that you have looked at the implications for a GCA strategy and included what kind of impact it has on the selected evidence compared to its outcomes and cost. Summarize the opportunities and the risks to ensure that you have that in place. And if you cannot evaluate a PICO that you think you will be needing in the future, for example, if you have a rare disease and the data absolutely is not able to capture, then make sure that you have a valid rationale that you can include in the dossiers. Okay. We have also looked into how the PICO simulation makes most sense and when it should be conducted. So the suggestion that we have is to do this in 2 stages. At the end of phase 2 of the clinical development, so that you can use the PICOs to support the phase 3 studies and the integrated real-world evidence generation plan. We also suggest that you should update it around 12 months before submission, so that you have a clear picture of the current environment and the landscape, to ensure that you have all the evidence needed and that you haven't missed anything, and also to support the finalization of the GCA dossier. And as such, I'm going to hand over to Andrew, who's going to talk about effective dossier development. Over to you, Andrew.
Thanks so much, Mia. And thanks to everyone who's joining us today. Let me start really. So the next couple slides, I really want to share our thoughts on effective dossier development and points to consider when you're pulling this information together. As Mia was saying, it's, we're looking at a substantial document, 700 pages plus, really. And I guess one of the first things we want to talk about is when you're pulling this information together, there is an information hierarchy to consider. So you start by assessing the scope of what the JCA is looking at. You start to do your systematic retrieval of the information. You pull together the content and data, and you start to build the dossier. Recognizing that RCT data is still going to be the highest strength of evidence, and ideally, you'll have a direct comparison of performance, and that'll be always considered to be top tier. Second will be different RCTs with more of an anchored indirect comparison, and slightly lower but still highly relevant is the single arm trial with unanchored indirect comparisons. And but all these are going to be part of the mix, and they'll just be assessed or considered slightly differently. The most important thing is just to make sure that the JCA dossier accurately reflects what the PICOs are saying. One of the key points I think that Mia made in the last section was, when you think about evidence collection and evidence generation planning, you really should think about scoping it, broadly, about all the different activities, all the different stakeholders you're trying to you're trying to satisfy. So obviously you've got regulatory, you've got then now the JCA dossier as well, and there are similarities. I mean, you really start to think about also what you're going to be needing in terms of your global value dossier and how you're going to be working to inform the affiliates. So the key point here really is to think about the information that you're collecting, and as you're starting to create content, we suggest maybe thinking about a content coordinator. One of the things that we're working with our clients on is web enabling some of the GVDs, web enabling some of the content, so that the local operating companies have the ability to, extract, search content to help them build the most effective and successful reimbursement dossier for national stakeholders. Think about maybe having a content analyst. When content comes in, think about different ways it could be tagged, different ways it might be used, so that when you do a search, it'll come up and you have access to it. And another benefit worth mentioning is this content coordinator, content analyst, whatever you want to call it. This hub will help you align across the business units, because if you have working with an organization that is maybe a bit more narrow and deep focus rather than a broader focus, and really not thinking about other stakeholders, and this will just help align, or at least give you a pivot point that you can work across the different business units, and that could help. The point on this slide here really is, as you're building this content, and again thinking about the multiple purposes that it's going to be used, So if you look here, this table here was really designed to highlight the types of content that you'll be collecting for the JCA, and actually what the national agencies will be looking for in terms of their national dossiers. So the idea is, maybe that phrase, do it once, do it right. If you scope it out, you tag it correctly, then you can repurpose it, reuse it. And that'll give you a chance to sort of really get the most out of the content and also have some consistency. You do want some consistency across the different dossiers. So really try to think about, how do we catch this, capture it, tag it, and make sure it's available for retrieval and reuse whenever possible. As we mentioned, this is complex. This is going to be organizationally, this is going to be challenging to your organizational structure, or it could be. And what we try to do here is really put some work streams going across from left to right. And, at the top, we've got some of our product development, commercialization checkpoints. We've got the regulatory timelines in the middle there. And then we've got the JCA timeline. And we recommend to our clients to really start thinking about the JCA approximately 20 months or so before you're going to submit. As Mia was saying in her presentation, the amount of time that you have to actually, when you hear back on the final PICOs to the time you actually have to pull together a dossier, you probably got to have some options that are already, you think are likely or have already been modeled, you're getting ready to work with. So what it means is you've got to be ready for a compressed timeline. And starting early is just makes sense. It just helps you, get your head around what the requirements are. Also start thinking about what do I need from regulatory, what do I need to do from reimbursement. It just gives you that much more time to start scoping and planning rather than having individual non-aligned actions. It just helps improve the ability to achieve multiple goals all at the same time. Building on that point, really, you start to look at the amount of business units that are going to be involved in some of this, and it's quite broad. Everything from regulatory, drug development, market access, HEOR, medical, clinical, plus working with our colleagues at the global level as well to make sure that this is all joined up. We do suggest that you start thinking early about running regulatory and European EU HTA processes in parallel. Start to understand some of the specific requirements, not only at the JCA, but within the national markets. Share evidence across, make sure that it's, you're just working well with your other parts of the business that are going to be engaging with these stakeholders that ultimately are going to affect the positioning of your product, the regulatory approval, the statements of relative clinical effectiveness, and ultimately national reimbursement. And speaking of national reimbursement, you will want to, or we recommend to our clients that you do keep track of changes in the national HTA. This is a new process. You can imagine some of the larger national HTA agencies maybe looking at the JCA document is more of advice or a suggestion, and maybe they'll still stick with their own national processes. Maybe others will actually take it and just realize that that's a great starting point, and we'll just immediately focus our resources on national market access, national pricing and reimbursement negotiations. So it makes sense to try to stay close to those changes at the national level. As we said earlier, there is an accelerated timeline, and in order to get ready for that sprint, we suggest that you think about doing some mock PICO analyses, trying to understand what each kind of potential scenario would look like, and how does it align or not with member states in terms of their choice of subpopulations, comparators, and outcomes. Like I say, the uncertainty and adaptation, you want to track that. My hunch is that some of the larger countries, maybe France and Germany, will maybe continue to do their own thing, maybe not. Some of the Baltics, some of the smaller countries, they may welcome this joint clinical assessment and, like I say, build on those findings without much adjustment. And it probably could vary depending on how well the PICOs in the JCA align with the national requirements. Makes sense to stay up to date with an SLR. It's going to be needed. A fresh one's going to be needed within 100 days of knowing the final PICO. And we suggest, creating some kind of automated reports, leveraging AI to support some of the screening. When you're looking at data analysis time, thinking about using standard macros for indirect treatment comparison analyses would probably help. Again, you want to be able to move quick, and you want to have some tools that you can grab and run with, really. Think about an analytical platform for RW real-world data, and trying to understand some of the patterns and analyses. Real-world data is a really challenging topic. It's not always easy to understand, to sort, sift, and prioritize what some of the content is showing, and it only emerges over time. And it makes sense to maybe, if it's important, think about that. How do you keep track of something that's going to be constantly coming out, constantly, being shared with stakeholders, and what does it mean for your product? And ultimately, you want to think about your global value dossier. So my team at ICON, we work on evidence dossiers, both for global dossiers, national HTA dossiers, and obviously JCA dossiers as well. And what we want to think about is the global value dossier, thinking about web enabling it so that you can retrieve the content, giving the LOCs the tools that they need, making the GVD relevant to national reimbursement discussions. And also think about, how do you empower them? How do you ensure that the local affiliates can understand, where the content is, if they have any gaps in what's been assembled at the central global level and what's required at the national level. How do we identify those, and how do we close those gaps as soon as possible so that you're able to get the best price and the best commercial terms for reimbursement of the new treatments? So I guess what I'd like to leave you with is that, the key point here, that once the JCA dossier has been assembled, it's been delivered, it's circulated, the member states do have the option, due consideration. It's not a binding document, and in it, you may see variation in how the results are applied. So it requires good communication, good dialogue between the global efforts, whether it's a GVD or JCA, and also what are the affiliates needing, and what are the national stakeholders requiring. So it's going to be a dialogue, and it's going to be changing, and it might probably, let's assume it's going to change at maybe different rates for different therapy areas as well. So a good ongoing dialogue between the top down and bottom up, from the affiliates into the global and global into the affiliates, to really kind of just keep that alignment and communication solid, so that if there's something that one market requires, if you can pick it up and include it in a global response or global dossier, that's even better. But really just sort of stay on top of the national requirements, because this is a new program and things will change as and everybody's learning. So with that, hopefully that was somewhat helpful, and I'll hand over to my colleague Sin, who will take you through the next section. Sin, over to you.
Thank you, Andrew. As Andrew mentioned, there is country level response to GCA after all the GCA submission being finalized. So you still have additional milestone to achieve after GCA. As we know, the HTA will be still conducted at the national level, and meaning there could be three scenarios. One is the adaptation, or adaptation with conditions, or reject what GCA evaluation. And for each scenario, you will facing different, slightly different approaches. For example, for fully adaptation, you will have your focus will be more focused on the economic analysis, and for the conditional adaptation, it possibly means the GCA is adopted by various scenarios. So you have to analyze what the scenarios are, and then based on that to conduct your economic analysis. And when the worst scenario happens, the country rejects what the GCA decision, meaning that a full country level of HTA submission would be required. And post that will be as what we normally see in the traditional HTA process, is a value-based pricing and how to risk mitigation strategies such as a risk-sharing agreement. So in a nutshell, what we can see, the key challenges post the GCA, including the heterogeneity in the national HTA requirements. For example, in Germany, they have AMNOG process, and in other countries, different processes are applied. And also the pricing and the reimbursement negotiations will be still at the national level. Last but not least is what Mia and Andrew has stated previously, is local data requirement to possibly still apply. So here I wanted to present at the policy level what the GCA could look like, and including the time, the HTA dossier, the price evaluation, and last but not least, the grouped effort. Firstly, let's focus on the time to country level evaluation first. So we can see there could be two scenarios here. One is the national process will not be delayed. This could be happening in France, meaning the evaluation would proceed even in absence of the GCA report. While some countries will proceed post the GCA report. For example, in Germany, the GBA has the authority to suspend the national benefit assessment for up to 3 months after you receive the positive approval from the EMA. The Spain will proceed just promotely after receiving the GCA. And in Netherlands, the full assessment will only begin after the GCA, so it's very clear for them. And then now we look at the HTA dossier changes. As Andrew mentioned earlier, there could be different approaches by different countries. For example, in France and Germany, it is required that data submitted by manufacturers for GCA should not be resubmitted in the national applications. This is applied for France and Germany. And for for some countries, they will still use the GCA findings, but you still need to submit the relevant information. And this will happen in Spain and the Netherlands, and they will update their dossier submission template to reflect these changes. There are some policy changes in Italy as well. However, there is no formal process being published, but we know there is a process maybe on the line to align with the GCA requirement. After the HTA dossier submission, of course, we will have to face the price evaluation and reimbursement. As you're possibly already aware, the national HTA agencies will continue to conduct their own reimbursement and pricing evaluation. This is as what we normally see for France. The SMR value will still remain the key driver for the pricing negotiation. For Germany, there is no impact, so it still need to assess the additional benefit. In Italy, as we've seen a year ago, there is an organizational change. So instead of two entity, now there is only one organization as CSE to conduct both scientific evidence and reimbursement conditions. In Spain, we would expect the evaluation still remain at the regional level and the reimbursement still be differentiated at the regional level. And in Netherlands, the pricing negotiation continue to be based on the Zane assessment and the EU reference pricing. The last, I want to really emphasize a grouped effort in response to the GCA changes. So there is a joint group called Joint Nordic HTA bodies covering Denmark, Finland, Iceland, Norway. And so what they have recently published is they will timely align the GCA with PICO analysis. And but they will more focused on the health economic assessment to provide robust Nordic level evaluations. And lastly, they will be more focused on the group and joint Nordic price negotiations for the assessment through the GNHB, meaning like post the GCA assessment, you may have different scenarios at country level or grouped assessment. So for the companies, you really need to prepare your scenarios and update your HTA submission dossier timely and follow the policies to really reflect and follow what is changing rapidly at the country level as well. Now we come into a case study. So this case study is published by HTACG. It's the coordination group. When the drug received the EMA positive approval, they have conducted 3 medicine PICO analysis to really to refine their process. And this we are using a digressive to really to see what's at the oncology, what that PICO could look like. And then the next slide, I will talk about after PICO, what's the reimbursement and the pricing look like in response to the PICO analysis. This is a very busy slide. I'm not expecting you to read everything, but what I want to say is PICO is driven by the P, i.e. the population, and the comparator. So as you can see, under the full population, which is adult patient with advanced CLC with the KRAS G12C mutation and progressed at least 1 prior line of systemic therapy, has 5 comparators under it. Right, so that leaves you for one of your full submitted population, you could face at least 5 PICOs based on what comparator you could be. And then that the PICO is driven by the subpopulations, and subpopulations could be split by prior therapy, histology, and lastly, these prior therapies is facing to multiple comparators. So for example, for this subpopulation that's split by prior therapy, and for each comparators, it has been appeared in the full population as a PICO 2, PICO 3, and PICO 1. So you can see the comparators that you use the full population will be translated into the subpopulation analysis. And then situation will get more complicated when it's been histology split. So you can see the more combination therapy being compared. And there are quite a lot for all scenarios based on the prior therapy, meaning, for example, in the last PICO 13, even the subpopulation is the same. You are facing the multiple comparators. So this is give you a nutshell and a picture how the PICO could be simulated and could be analyzed. Let me go on to the next slide to really look into so what after the PICO. So adagrasib has now has 2 HTA published in France and Italy. In UK, it's still in process, although in Germany there is no formal document available, but we can use some previous understandings to see what the scenario could like. So in France and Italy, they both reimbursed at the full population, and their HTA-assessed comparator is still docetaxel. However, the critics give it a really weak and mild SMR, meaning the 15% reimbursement, and the ASMR 5 means the drug is only can be priced versus the comparator or less. The key critiques is the lack of the clinical relevance of 1.5 months of PFS improvement, and lack of the clinical relevance of the ORR. Another one is the open label trial design. And thirdly is a lack of the statistically significant differences in OS and the quality of life. In Italy, it's currently in class C, meaning the drug has not been evaluated for reimbursement. It is conditional or restricted regarding to the sales and effective use of the medical product, and it's under the risk management plan. In UK, it's currently submission is the same as PICO-1, is the full population. It is likely to be docetaxel. However, as we can see in previous NICE submission, critics could facing the high ISA if there is no discount or require the long-term data. In Germany, it is, as we know, in Germany, it's likely to be assessed based on the prior therapy and histology, i.e. they will assess the subpopulations benefit, and for the HTA assess the comparator, it could be vary based on the subpopulations. And the critics is very likely to be based on the selection of the comparator, availability of the data for assessing the additional benefit of subpopulations, and no statistically significant differences in OS and safety. And endpoint selection could also be challenged. For example, if it is lack of quality of life data or symptomatic and health status. So in summary, the PICO will be applied. The PICO analyzed the population will be split by histology subpopulation and prior therapies, while the reimbursed population, it seems likely to be the full population. However, it could be vary, as we can see in Germany. And in terms of the comparator, PICO do include the new agencies such as Therapies. However, in the country level comparator or reimbursement pricing comparator, a traditional ones could be used, such as docetaxel, due to maybe lack of approval or approval delays. Lastly is the pricing. Pricing is mainly at the country level, while GCA findings possibly will to inform the decision, but won't dictate the negotiations and the final pricing approval. So the last I want to say, for the post GCA at the country level requirement, we still need to consider the additional evidence requirement, and a clinical trial need to all reflect the country level reimbursement requirement to ensure your last milestone is achieved and to fulfill your pricing expectations. And from there, I will hand over to my colleague, Liz, to discuss about the trial design.
Thanks, Chin. I'm just going to move this forward. So just to remind you, because I see some of you have joined the call later, I'm a therapeutic expert within ICON Oncology, Drug Development and Solutions and Consulting Group. And I'm going to expand on some of the points that Chin and the other speakers made, very much through the lens of a therapeutic expert supporting oncology protocol, indication, and program considerations. And for me in my day-to-day role, at the core of the new EU Joint Clinical Assessment is something that we're all really deeply familiar with already. The concept of clinical effectiveness isn't new at all. But I guess what's different now and what's really important is how formally this process is and how transparently this will be assessed at a European level within oncology therapy area. So as a CRO, we've long worked with sponsors to evaluate oncology protocols and indication considerations and development programs, always through a market access lens and through a regulatory approval lens. And we try to anticipate what will resonate with payers. We try to identify where a product will fit in the therapeutic landscape and to ensure that the data that's generated supports both regulatory approval and eventual reimbursement. I guess what the JCA brings on top of that is not entirely a new burden, but it really sharpens the focus. It reinforces the need to start early, and that's a key message that all the other previous speakers have already reinforced, and to design with patient benefit and comparative effectiveness in mind. Not to think simply about whether a product works, but how well it works, for whom, compared to what, and why that matters. So in that sense, it enhances the process that's there already. It's very patient-centric evolution of how we approach evidence generation. And it really brings a greater alignment between regulatory and access strategy across Europe. So the PICO framework and the joint scientific consultation that Mia mentioned at the start, it really is a strategic anchor for the oncology protocol planning. It sits at the heart of the JCA. Like I said, it's not new, but under JCA, it becomes an early checkpoint, excuse the pun, in how we think about oncology trial design, access readiness, and ultimately clinical value. Clinical value really is the key core message that, like I said, has always been there, but it's really reinforced. So back to the PICO framework, the population, and this has already been touched upon, but in oncology in particular, we really need to define the right patient population. It's becoming more and more nuanced in this era of precision and targeted medicine. Assessors will expect just strong justification, not just the tumor type, but why this subgroup, why this biomarker, why this line of therapy. And that really needs to reflect clinical practice in oncology across Europe. It forces us to ask early who benefits the most. That's a key foundational question. For intervention, again, we must position the therapy clearly within the treatment pathway. Is this a first-line backbone? Is this maintenance add-on? Is it second-line rescue? So again, it's that deep understanding of how the intervention fits within the real-world therapeutic landscape, and that helps you align the protocol with European clinical guidelines, ESMO guidelines, and ultimately with payer expectations. So for the comparator, and this is probably one of the most complex concepts within this, is often where things diverge between regulatory and clinical effectiveness thinking. For example, the comparator used in a global trial may not always reflect the standard of care in some of those big markets across Europe. So justification for the comparator is really critical. It has to be relevant, accepted, and reflective of current clinical practice in major markets. I don't think any of that is new, and certainly that's always how we approach assessment and review of oncology programs, protocols, designs. But like I said, it really reinforces and sharpens, hones the focus from the get-go. And lastly, outcomes, the same core messaging. It's a key anchor within oncology protocol and indication considerations. It's not new, but it must resonate with what payers care about. It's not enough to show statistical significance. The outcomes must be clinically meaningful, really patient relevant, and of course, timely. things like overall survival, quality of life, durable responses, the classic oncology endpoints, if surrogates are being used to really validate the context there. So PICO is more than a checklist. It really is a strategic framework, and when addressed early, it strengthens everything. It strengthens everything that follows. So this slide touches on some of the interconnected forces within the JCA era. You've got protocol and indication strategy, clinical development, and statistical design, and they're always interconnected, and they're particularly interconnected in the context of JCA. Protocol and indication considerations. The indication choice, your lead, your target indication, your TPP from the very beginning informs your PICO. What's the unmet need? How are guidelines evolving? Is the target population clinically relevant and impactful? So these questions shape everything downstream. Again, this has been our thinking from always as we approach oncology and proposals, but it really sharpens the focus. The clinical development program, the trial design itself must now be anchored in early PICO thinking. So endpoints, comparators, subgroup analysis, they aren't just statistical decisions, they really are access enablers. And then for the statistical design, it's become so complex in oncology with adaptive designs, powering decisions, sensitivity analyses, all of these concepts and much more must support the robustness of the clinical effectiveness across a diverse European setting. So I guess the takeaway is that the JCA expectations aren't abstract, they're actionable, they're concrete, and when considered early, they align protocol decision with clinical relevance and access success. So for me, the JCA brings a huge opportunity to really enhance patient-focused drug development, which is a huge foundational concept at global agencies, EMA in particular. It helps us focus to build stronger, smarter programs with the patient at the center and Europe in mind from the very get-go. So that was short and brief. It's a topic that could be really expanded on. I'm going to hand you back to Mia, who's going to quickly go through some summary concepts.
Yes. Keeping in mind that we are actually at the end of the presentation, I will do this really quickly. And what I really think that we all have emphasized is make sure that you start early. Do early planning, take advantage of this joint scientific consultation, make sure that you start the evidence generation plan early and start to produce the GCA dossier as early as possible. Conduct the PICO simulation so that you have the evidence and an understanding of the evidence needed. As I said, make sure to start the work on the GCA dossier early, and also not only think about the GCA, also think about the local HTA submissions and the process, and keep track on the changes that are happening in this area due to the new GCA environment.
Really just wanted to thank all four of you for your amazing presentations today. So much great information. You all really are so insightful. So thank you again for being here and for taking the time to do this for us. In closing, we hope that you enjoyed this HealthEconomics.com webinar sponsored by ICON, and I hope that you enjoy the rest of your day.